The phone rang before the sun was up, cutting through the quiet like a blade. I remember staring at Emily's name on the screen, wondering why my daughter would call this early on Christmas Eve. The house was still half asleep, breathing slow in the winter dark, and I felt that old familiar ache settle in my chest before I even picked up. Her voice was soft, careful. Too careful. She talked around something the way people do when the truth is heavier than they want to admit. I stood there beside the window watching snow drift across the yard, listening to her say words she thought would land gently. But they didn't. "Dad, we're having Christmas dinner at Red Elm this year. And I just don't want you to feel embarrassed by how expensive it is. Maybe it's best if you stay home." Just like that. No anger, no malice, just the kind of politeness that hurts more than cruelty ever could. I didn't argue. Men like me don't raise our voices. We let silence do its work. But when the call ended, I kept staring at my reflection in the dark glass, wondering when exactly my own daughter started believing I didn't belong at her table. And as the house settled back into stillness, one simple truth hit me harder than her words. They thought I couldn't afford dinner. They had no idea what I'd already built. The morning opened quietly the way winter mornings in this house always had. Light slipped through the blinds in thin silver lines, settling across the kitchen table, and the mug of coffee I had set down moments earlier. The radio on the counter played an old country tune, soft enough that it felt like it came from the walls themselves. I could hear the furnace breathe in the basement. Everything moved slow and steady, the familiar rhythm of a man who had lived long enough to appreciate silence. The chair across from me waited in its usual stillness. I ran my hand along the back of it as I walked past, brushing away a faint line of dust that had settled there overnight. My wife used to sit in that chair and hum when she read the paper. Even now, the memory felt close enough to touch. I let my fingers rest there a moment longer than necessary, then took my seat and wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat felt good. It made me feel rooted. The phone buzzed on the counter. I watched it vibrate for a second, the name of my daughter glowing across the screen. Emily rarely called early. She texted, sent pictures of my granddaughter wearing mismatched socks or holding a crayon like it weighed a pound. But calls were different. Calls usually meant something sat heavy. I picked it up and brought it to my ear. She asked about the truck first. She always did. I told her it was fine, that it was tougher than I was. She laughed a little, but there was something behind the sound that pulled the morning tighter. A quiet hesitation. I could feel it even before she spoke again. She told me she and Mark had plans for Christmas dinner. Red Elm Bistro. A special place, she said. White tablecloths, candlelight. Her company had given them a voucher, and they wanted to do something nice for the holiday. I listened to her words as if they were being placed carefully on a table, one at a time. There was a pause, then the kind that stretches a thin thread between two people. When she continued, her voice lowered. She said she thought maybe I should sit this one out. She did not want me to feel uncomfortable with the prices. She tried to dress it in concern, tried to make it sound gentle, but the sentence carried an edge anyway. An edge I felt down to the bone. I did not answer right away. The radio song ended, and the silence behind her grew more noticeable. I heard another voice through the phone, a quieter one, but close enough that I knew it was Mark. He spoke in that efficient tone of his, the tone of a man who wants small problems handled quickly. He said she should just tell me. Said it was better this way. Emily waited for my reply. I could picture her standing in her kitchen, fingers twisting the edge of a dish towel, eyes on the floor. I told her not to worry. I said it calmly, slowly, the way men say things when they already understand more than they let on. She let out a breath I could hear. Promised to send pictures of the night. Then the call slipped away, and the phone went dark in my hand. I set it next to the coffee. The steam had thinned, leaving a faint trail on the surface. I did not drink it. I walked to the small office down the hall and pushed open the door. The smell of old paper and machine oil drifted up faintly. The window in that room always let in softer light, like it filtered the world before it reached the desk. I pulled open the drawer. It stuck for a moment, then gave way. Inside were pieces of a life that had been lived with steady hands. Registration slips, a folded newspaper clipping about the fire at my garage years ago, a photograph of me holding Emily when she was no bigger than a loaf of bread, her face pressed into my shoulder, one tiny hand gripping the collar of my shirt. I paused there, thumb smoothing the crease beside the photograph, letting that memory settle in. Then my hand found what it always found tucked in the back. A key. The metal head worn smooth but still legible if you knew what you were looking for. Red elm. I lifted it from the drawer and felt the cold weight of it settle in my palm. I had held it through better times and worse ones. The metal carried those years quietly. Next to it rested an envelope bearing Emily's name, written in my own careful handwriting from a different chapter of my life. I had planned to give it to her once, before life rerouted everything, before grief rearranged what I thought I could carry. I touched the envelope gently and placed it back into the dark of the drawer. Some things wait for the right season, but the key I kept in my hand. When I walked back to the kitchen, the light had changed. Clouds had moved in, dimming the room to a softer gray. The coffee in the mug no longer steamed, so I poured it down the sink and rinsed the cup. My eyes drifted back to the refrigerator door, where an old drawing hung under a magnet shaped like a wrench. A stick figure that Emily had made years ago. It showed the two of us standing outside my garage, my arms drawn too long, my smile lopsided. I placed my hand on that drawing for a moment. There was a time she had seen me larger than life. I let that memory breathe. I took down my canvas coat from the hook. The fabric felt familiar as it settled around my shoulders. My hands slipped into the pockets out of habit. My right hand closed around the key, as if it belonged there. I opened the front door. Cold air moved in a slow wave, touching my face, sliding under the collar of my coat. Snow had started while I was in the other room. It drifted across the street in small flakes that seemed to hesitate before landing. The neighborhood felt the way it always did on winter mornings, quiet and honest. I stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked under my boots. I looked over the yard, the truck, the thin layer of snow settling on the mailbox. My fingers pressed the key through the fabric of my coat pocket. For a moment I stood still, listening to the quiet settle around me, feeling the cold wrap itself around my breath. Then I closed the door behind me and took the first step into the snow. The cold did not push me back. It felt like something else entirely. Something waiting. Something waking. The cold followed me to the truck as I walked across the yard, settling on my shoulders like a weight I had carried before. I brushed the snow from the windshield with the back of my hand and watched the powder fall in slow spirals to the ground. The engine coughed once when I turned the key, then caught with that familiar shake, as if reminding me it still had life left in it. The key to Red Elm shifted in my coat pocket when I sat down, pressing lightly against my leg like a thought I could not shake. I let the truck idle for a while, the heater blowing warm air that never seemed to reach my hands. The house behind me stood quiet, its windows dim, its rooms already turning toward night. I glanced once at the passenger seat. Still empty. I felt the silence of that space in a way I could not name. I put the truck in gear and eased out onto the street, my headlights carving thin paths across the fresh snow. The afternoon drifted by slowly. I spent the early hours doing the kind of chores that give a man purpose when the world around him has grown too quiet. I swept the porch, sorted the mail, oiled the hinges on the back door even though they did not really need it. The movements steadied me, each task small and familiar, each one keeping the day from slipping through my fingers too easily. When the light outside began to fade, I found myself standing in front of the fridge. There was another drawing from my granddaughter pinned there, the crayon lines bright against the white surface. 3 figures stood under a crooked sun. Emily, the child, Mark. The names were written neatly underneath each one in her careful handwriting. I stared at it for a moment. The refrigerator hummed softly beside me. The silence around the edges of the picture felt louder than it should have. I reached into the closet and took down the small, stuffed reindeer I had bought weeks earlier. It was soft in my hands, simple and cheerful. I wrapped it in the old red paper from the cupboard, smoothing each fold until it lay neat and tight. For a moment, I considered writing her name on it. Instead, I placed the blank gift gently on the table and let it sit there under the glow of the kitchen lamp. It was close to dusk when I climbed into the truck again. The sky hung low and gray, the light thinning into that quiet blue that arrives before evening settles for good. I drove slowly, following roads I had known for years past, houses with lights turning on behind curtains, past families gathering around their tables. After a while, the city streets took over the buildings, drawing closer, the sidewalks busier. Red Elm came into view at the corner of Maple and Fifth, its warm glow spilling across the snow like an invitation meant for someone else. The windows cast soft light onto the sidewalk. I could see silhouettes moving inside the shapes of coats, dresses, raised glasses. It looked the way Christmas dinners often look in magazine pictures. Warm, certain, complete. I parked a little ways down and cut the engine. The wrapped gift sat on the passenger seat, the gold trees on the paper catching a bit of light from the street lamp above. I picked it up and held it loosely, letting the weight of it settle in my hand. Then I stepped out into the cold. When I pushed the door open, the heat of the restaurant met me almost immediately, carrying with it a faint mix of roasted herbs and warm bread. The wooden floors gleamed under the soft light. The voices of diners rose and fell in gentle waves. I stood for a moment just inside, letting the door close behind me, letting the warmth wrap itself around my shoulders. The hostess looked up as I approached. She was young, with dark hair pulled back neatly, and she greeted me with the kind of smile practiced to put strangers at ease. I told her my name and explained that I had a gift for my granddaughter. I said it simply. She opened the reservation book, her eyes moving down the list until they stopped. When she looked up again, the smile on her face carried a softness I recognized. "I do not see you listed with the Barnes reservation," she said. Her voice was gentle, careful, almost apologetic. The kind of voice people use when the truth is fixed, and they wish it wasn't. I nodded once. I set the gift down on the counter, my hand lingering a second before slipping away. I asked her to make sure it reached the little girl with the bright curls and the quick smile. As she took the package, I caught a familiar scent in the air. The faint, warm smell of varnished wood, the same varnish Margaret had chosen years ago when the place first opened. I glanced past the hostess stand toward the bar. The edge still held a small notch near the corner where I had once repaired a loose panel late at night. A tiny mark in the wood, but I knew it instantly. That single flaw still there told me the place had kept a piece of me, Even after life pulled everything else apart, my eyes drifted down the length of the dining room and found the long table near the back. Emily sat there under a row of soft lights, her face warm from the glow. She laughed at something the child said, her hand reaching to straighten a paper crown that had slipped over one bright eye. For a moment, she looked peaceful, untouched by the weight of the morning. Then her gaze swept the room casual at first, until it met mine. There was a flicker, a small shift in her face. Her smile faltered. The way a branch bends when the wind catches it just right. She placed her hand on the table as if thinking about rising. Her shoulders moved an inch, then stopped when Mark leaned close and touched her arm. He said something low. His eyes glanced toward me, landed for a second, then retreated. Emily settled back into her chair. I could see the apology in her expression even from across the room. A man in a dark suit walked past the hostess stand at that moment. He glanced from the reservation list to the dining room, then to the gift I had just set down. "That your father-in-law?" he called lightly toward the table. I could hear Mark's answer drifting back through the noise, faint but clear enough. "He is not working these days." The words slid into the warm air and hung there for a moment before dissolving. They did not sting at first. They landed more slowly, like a chill that sinks in only after you walk a few steps into winter. The hostess looked back at me, then her voice dropping quietly. "Good to see you again, Mr. Marlowe." There was memory in her tone. A recognition that belonged to a different chapter, one my daughter and her husband had never bothered to ask about. I gave her a small nod and stepped away from the counter. I did not look again toward the long table. I did not look at Emily or Mark or the child with the crooked crown. I walked through the warmth of the room and pushed the door open. The cold greeted me with its steady hand. The light from the restaurant fell behind me, fading across the sidewalk as the door closed. The street was quiet. Snow clung to the curbs in soft drifts. I stood there for a long breath, the sound of distant traffic blending with the hush of falling flakes. My fingers brushed the shape of the key through my coat pocket, and I felt the metal shift lightly against a coin beside it, the faintest clink rising in the still air. That small sound lingered as I stepped toward the truck, a reminder of something unfinished, something waiting just beyond the edges of what this night had shown me. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that settles after a long day, when the air feels a little heavier than usual. I set my keys on the counter and felt the weight of the evening linger in my chest. The memory of Emily hesitating in that restaurant window stayed with me softer now, but still sharp around the edges. I walked to the kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten most of my meals since my wife passed, and let my hand rest on the wooden surface for a moment before I sat down. The envelope lay where I had left it, half hidden under a stack of mail I had not bothered to sort. I picked it up again and held it between my fingers. The paper felt older than I remembered, the corners worn, as if time itself had been rubbing against it. I waited there for a long breath, letting the house steady around me, before I finally slid a finger beneath the seal. The soft rip of the paper echoed in the empty room. I drew out the documents and unfolded them slowly. At the top, in ink that had faded a shade since the day it was signed, was the contract for my investment in Red Elm Bistro, 18 years old. I traced the line where my name appeared, written firm and careful, back when I still believed good intentions had a way of finding their place in the world. I had meant to give these papers to Emily, not as a surprise, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet promise that she would have something solid to lean on one day. The day I planned to hand it to her was the same day I lost my wife. Life shifted its weight, and anything that was not essential fell into drawers, boxes, and the corners of rooms we stopped entering. The envelope had sat there ever since, tucked away with the things grief convinces us we can deal with later. A low hum from the heater filled the space. I pressed the papers flat on the table, letting my palm rest on them, as if they needed reassurance. Maybe I did. The light above me flickered once, a small pulse, like the house was reminding me it was still alive. The phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet, steady and calm. I reached for it without hurry. It was Jonah. His voice carried that familiar rasp, a mix of kitchen heat and long hours. He did not speak loudly, but there was something behind his words, something like respect, shaped into a question. "Margaret wants to talk to you," he said. "She told me tonight. Said she has something that belongs with you before she makes any decisions." I let the silence sit for a moment, letting his words settle. Jonah had never been a man to embellish anything. If he said Margaret wanted to see me, it meant she meant it. "Is she all right?" I asked, my voice low. "She is ready," he said. Then after a breath he added, "She only wants to speak with you." The sentence held more weight than he realized. Maybe he knew. Maybe he did not want to push it. I thanked him and told him I would come by in the morning. He paused, as if he had something else on his mind, but decided against it. The line clicked quiet. I set the phone down and looked at the contract again. The edges curled slightly upward, as if the papers were trying to lift themselves from the table. I slid them back into the envelope and placed it next to the key from Red Elm. The metal caught a bit of the kitchen light, casting a thin line of reflection across the wood. Seeing the two of them together stirred something that had been asleep for too long. My hands rested there for a while, side by side, with the key and the envelope. Hands that had once lifted engines with ease, hands that had held my daughter's small fingers on her first day of school, hands that had steadied my wife during her final months. They had carried more than most people knew, and even now, with the years on them, they still felt capable of holding something new. Outside, the wind brushed against the siding of the house, carrying the faint sound of snow shifting across the driveway. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. The room dimmed when I turned off the light, but a faint glow from the window spilled across the table, resting on the key, and the envelope like a quiet promise. I walked toward the hallway, then stopped and looked back. The air felt different, as if tomorrow already had its hand on the doorknob. The key gave a soft tap against the envelope, when the house settled a small sound, but clear enough to reach me across the room. Some conversations arrive late, but right on time. I stayed there for one more breath, letting that thought move through me before I stepped into the darkened hallway where the night waited patient and still. The house settled into silence after I stepped into the hallway, the kind of deep quiet that asks you to listen whether you want to or not. I slept in pieces, drifting in and out, as if someone kept opening a door inside my mind and letting in a draft. When the alarm finally murmured its soft reminder, the sky outside was still a faint gray. I rose slowly, letting the cold floor pull me the rest of the way into the day. In the kitchen, I kept the lights low. The coffee maker clicked and hissed, sending steam into the air until the window fogged over. The envelope and the key rested on the table where I had left them, touched by a weak glow from the street lamp outside. I picked them up together, their weight small but certain, and slipped them into my coat pocket. Outside, frost dusted the hood of the truck, and the metal of the door handle stung through my glove. I brushed off the windshield with the side of my sleeve and climbed in. The engine groaned once before finding its rhythm, and soon the truck rolled through the quiet neighborhood tires, crunching over the thin crust of snow that had hardened overnight. The sun was only beginning to consider the horizon when I turned onto Maple. Red Elm waited on the corner with its porch light still burning, the kind of light you leave on for someone who knows the way home without needing directions. The windows were dim, but a soft glow from the kitchen revealed a sliver of movement inside. I stepped out and felt the cold bite at my cheeks. As I reached the door, a faint ache ran up my left knee, a reminder of years crouched under cars. It matched the stiffness I had seen in others more and more as we all aged into our 50s and 60s. I pushed the door open and stepped into the muted warmth of the restaurant. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and yesterday's bread. Chairs still sat upside down on most of the tables. But at the corner near the front window, Margaret waited, a wool scarf draped over her shoulders, even though the heat was on. Her hands curled around a mug, and I noticed a slight tremor in her fingers when she lifted it. "You look like you beat the sun here," she said, her voice roughened at the edges by age or perhaps an early morning. I shrugged out of my coat. "Habit," I told her. "Old mechanics wake up before anything else does." She gave a soft huff that might have been a laugh. Then she reached into the bag at her feet and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table with a kind of reverence that told me what it was even before I sat down. I eased into the chair opposite her. The paper waited between us, its edges browned, its creases worn. My wife's handwriting met me as soon as I unfolded it. A single line made the air in my chest tighten. She had written it on the night she thanked Red Elm for helping us after the fire. I could still remember how her hand had trembled when she passed it to Margaret through the takeout window. Margaret watched me read. Her eyes had softened, but there was strain around them, a tiredness she was not trying to hide anymore. "Your wife asked me to keep that safe," she said quietly. "She told me Alex will never let himself need anyone. So keep this, and remind him one day that he was never alone." I pressed my hand lightly over the letter, feeling the shape of her name beneath my palm. Something in me softened, like ice breaking under warm light. Margaret shifted in her chair and winced slightly before straightening up. Her hand moved to her lower back for a brief second. "You all right?" I asked. She waved off the concern, but her eyes betrayed a weariness. "Just a reminder that I am not 30 anymore," she said. Her hand trembled again as she reached for a newer stack of papers. She steadied it against the table. "I am selling the place, Alex. I thought I could give it a few more years. My body has other plans." She pushed the documents toward me. I saw the restaurant's name at the top. I saw her signature. And below it all, I saw the terms that linked my old investment to this moment. I looked up and met her gaze. "Why me?" I asked. She took a slow breath, as if choosing words she had carried for a long time. "Because you cared about this place before it had anything to offer. Because you stood up for me when the bank would not. And because some places deserve to be held by hands that remember where the first nail went." I let the papers sit there untouched. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what she was offering settled around us, quiet and steady. The kitchen door swung open and Leo stepped out, wiping flour from his hands. His apron was dusted white, and he smelled faintly of dough and onions. He spotted me and grinned. "Did not expect to see you this early, Mr. Marlowe." His voice carried across the empty room like a reminder that time keeps moving, whether we are ready or not. I nodded. "Good to see you, Leo." He walked closer, balancing a tray as he spoke. "You once told me things run longer when someone cares enough to look under the hood. I think about that sometimes." Then he disappeared back into the kitchen, letting the door swing shut behind him. Margaret watched him go. "He is one of the good ones," she said softly. "You helped him more than you know." Her attention returned to me. "Everything is prepared." The lawyer filed what he needed to file. "All that remains is your decision." I reached for the pen she had set near the documents. My hand paused above it. Not because I doubted her, or the place, or the timing, but because moments like this do not announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, asking you to choose with the same hands that held you through worse days. I finally picked up the pen. It felt familiar, balanced, as if it belonged there. I signed slowly, my name settling onto the page with a firmness I had not felt in a long time. When it was done, I set the pen down and breathed out. Margaret looked at the paper, then at me, something like relief passing through her expression. "By tonight, this place will be yours in every way that counts," she said. I stood with her as she adjusted her scarf. She moved carefully, her body stiff, but determined. As we walked to the door, she paused to straighten a chair. Her fingers lingered on the wood, saying goodbye, in a language only she and the building understood. I stepped outside first. The cold air met me with a quiet clarity brushing against my face. Through the window, I saw Margaret still standing there, the morning light settling around her shoulders. I reached into my pocket and touched the key. It tapped softly against the envelope, the sound small but sharp, like something clicking into place after too many years. The sky brightened by a shade, and for a moment the world felt steady, in a way it had not felt for a long time. The sky had shifted by the time I pulled into my driveway, a thin winter light stretching itself across the street like it was trying to hold the day together. I stepped inside and set my coat on the back of the chair, the quiet of the house settling around me, the way dust settles after an engine shuts off. The envelope with the signed papers still rested in my pocket, warm from my body heat, steady in a way I wished my thoughts were. I had barely set a kettle on the stove when I heard tires on gravel. The sound pulled me toward the window before I even realized I had moved. Emily climbed out of the passenger seat, holding a plastic container with both hands, as if it were fragile. Mark stood behind her, adjusting his collar and brushing at his sleeves, too careful for a man simply delivering leftovers. They walked up the path together, both trying to look comfortable, both failing. I opened the door before they knocked. Emily held out the container, and her voice tried to find a softness that didn't quite land. "We thought you might want some dinner from last night." I looked at the container condensation clouding the inside. It was the kind of kindness people offer when they know they have hurt you and cannot take the words back. I thanked them and stepped aside to let them in. Emily walked to the kitchen table without asking the way she used to when she was young. Mark followed slower, his eyes flicking around the house like he was measuring the air for tension. They stood there while I set the container down. Inside was a piece of roast, a spoonful of potatoes, and a roll. Someone had pressed the lid too tight, and when I opened it, the scent drifted up and filled the room. I watched Emily glance at the empty seat across from mine, the one her mother used to fill. She looked away quickly, as if the sight had startled her. Mark cleared his throat. "We just wanted to check in," he said. I could hear carefulness in every word, the same carefulness he used last night when he talked about money loud enough for me to hear. He rubbed his thumb against his wedding band, a nervous habit he probably didn't know he had. Emily finally spoke, her fingers resting lightly on the back of the chair. "I should have handled things differently at the restaurant. I was worried you might feel out of place. It was crowded and people were talking about work, and I thought maybe it would be easier if you—" She paused, searching for something she could live with saying. "If you didn't have to deal with all that." Her voice dipped at the end, just enough to show she knew the apology was only half formed. I nodded, letting the moment settle. There was no need to press her further. People arrive at the truth in their own time. While we stood there, the mail truck growled to a stop outside. The sound rolled through the house like a familiar memory. I stepped onto the porch, and the cold met me sharply. The mailbox creaked as I pulled it open. A small stack of envelopes sat inside, most of them dull with holiday flyers. One envelope bore the bank's logo clean and official, the kind that always seems to hold something heavier than paper. I went back inside and placed the stack on the counter. Before I could sort through them, the bank envelope slid loose and opened just enough for a corner of the document to show. Emily reached for it automatically, the way someone might reach to steady a falling glass. Her eyes caught the name of the restaurant printed at the top. Then the line beneath it. Ownership transfer confirmation. She froze, her breath catching in a small, almost silent way, the kind of sound only a father would notice. Dad, what is this? The question carried no accusation, only confusion and a thin thread of disbelief. Mark stepped closer, reading from over her shoulder. His face shifted in a way he could not hide, something between surprise and the quick calculation of a man who realizes he has misunderstood the room. I took the envelope from Emily's hands gently and folded the flap closed. Their eyes stayed on me, waiting for an explanation I had no intention of turning into a speech. I have known that place a long time, I said. That was all. Nothing more was needed. Emily studied my face the way she used to when she was little, trying to figure out if I was proud or hurt or something in between. Mark looked down, his jaw tightening, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in him, not arrogance. A quiet recognition that he had misjudged a man he barely understood. They stayed a few minutes longer, both speaking softly, both sensing the shift in the air. When they left, Emily lingered at the doorway. Her hand brushed my arm, a gesture small enough to miss if I had turned away too soon. Then she stepped outside, and I watched them walk back to the car, their shadows stretching across the driveway. When the house settled again, it did so slowly, like it was exhaling after holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table with the container of food in front of me untouched. The room felt larger than usual, the quiet deeper. I looked at the chair across from me, the one with the cushion flattened from years of use. My hand rested on the top of it, almost without thinking. A memory stirred something warm and old, then drifted away before it could settle. I leaned back and let the silence fill the room. Through the window, the late afternoon light pressed against the glass, dim and steady. On the counter, the bank envelope caught a thin beam, the white paper glowing almost faintly. My phone buzzed once against the table. I did not reach for it. I just let the sound hang there, suspended in the stillness. Some moments do not announce themselves as turning points. They sit quietly beside you, waiting for you to notice the air has changed. I sat there a little longer, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Then I let the room be quiet again, the kind of quiet that fills the space inside a man when he finally stops letting others decide where he belongs. Snow fell in a thin, drifting line across the windshield as I sat there for a moment, letting the engine idle. The air outside carried that quiet weight winter evenings often have, in this part of the country, a kind of hush that settles before the night decides what it wants to become. Emily and Mark waited on the porch, bundled in their coats, watching the truck, with a mix of confusion and caution that had its own silence. I motioned for them to get in. No explanation, no tone. Just movement. Emily climbed into the passenger seat, careful as if she were stepping into someone else's story. Mark settled in behind her, and the door closed with a soft thud. The kind of sound you feel more than you hear. We drove without talking. Houses slipped by with their warm windows and quiet lawns, the sort of scenes that make you measure your own life without intending to. Emily kept her hands clasped on her lap. She took a breath once, as if she meant to say something, but the words never made it past her throat. By the time the lights of Red Elm came into view, the sun had already dipped and left a faint violet edge on the sky. The bistro glowed through the glass, soft and amber, the way places do when they've seen enough years to know what kind of warmth matters. I pulled into the side lot. The air changed the moment we stepped out, colder and sharper, yet something inside me felt steady, as if the cold knew better than to push too hard tonight. Emily looked at the entrance with a flicker of recognition, not the kind shaped by memory, but by an instinct she could not yet name. When we stepped inside, the room paused. Not a dramatic hush, only a small shift as the staff turned toward us. A few nods, a few warm greetings. Jonah stepped forward with that quiet smile he saves for people who matter. Emily stopped mid-stride, her shoulders lowered not in defeat, but in realization. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, they all know you." She did not ask how. She did not ask why. She simply saw it. I watched her eyes trace the room the way a child studies a familiar place after growing tall enough to see over the counters. There was a softness in her expression, the kind that comes when pride and shame collide so quickly that a person cannot decide which one hurts more. Jonah placed a hand over his apron as he spoke. "Good to have you back. Your table is ready." There was no announcement in his voice, only recognition. Emily stood still for a moment before following him, the air around her, shifting as if she were walking through two versions of herself. Near the host stand hung a small wooden frame. Nothing ornate, just a simple piece of walnut polished by years of light and dust. Inside it, a quiet line of engraved brass carried a name time had waited patiently to reveal. Emily's gaze landed on it, and her breath caught. Her fingers rose hesitant, as though touching the glass might break whatever she had just begun to understand. The plaque rested there without pride, without claim, only truth. She read it once, twice, then lowered her hand. Her voice came out softer than the room deserved. "I never knew." I let the quiet sit between us. Some truths do not need volume to be heard. Mark tried to fill the silence with a question that stumbled before it fully formed. "Why would you never say anything about this?" His voice wavered, and he cleared his throat. I could see him searching for a way to stand in that moment without shrinking from it. I answered the only way a man like me knows how. Some things are not meant to be performed. The dining room had been kept closed for the holiday, but the kitchen was warm and working. Jonah returned with a small bowl in his hands, steam rising through the dim light. He set it in front of Emily with a careful gesture. Her old favorite. She froze. The scent carried her backward in time, past the weight of adulthood, past the years she learned to look away from small things that once mattered, back to evenings when her mother sat across from her in this same room. Emily reached for the spoon, and her fingers trembled. She tried to lift it without being noticed, but the shake was too honest. She steadied it with her other hand and took a small sip. Her eyes softened, then darkened, then filled with something her voice could not yet hold. She looked down, trying to hide the way the memory cracked her open. The spoon dipped again, slower this time, as if she were apologizing with each movement. I did not touch her shoulder, or speak her name. Some moments belong to the person living them, not the person witnessing them. Mark stood close enough to see the truth settling in her, yet far enough to feel the distance between who he thought I was and who stood in front of him now. His jaw tightened once, then eased. He searched for words, but found only honesty. "I was wrong," he said finally, eyes lowering. "I made assumptions that were not mine to make." I nodded. No anger, no triumph. Only acknowledgement that he had taken his first real step toward understanding. We lingered a little while longer, not speaking much, just breathing in the warmth of the place and letting the light do what it does best, which is reveal things gently. When we walked out, the snow had begun to fall again, softer than before. Emily stood at the curb for a moment and looked back at the windows glowing against the night. She did not speak, but the way she wrapped her arms around herself told me she was holding something she had no name for yet. She took a slow breath and turned toward me. There was a new weight in her eyes, not heavy, only honest. We walked toward the truck. The snow brushed our coats, settling without hurry the way truth settles when it finally finds its place. The morning light rested on the front windows of Red Elm when I walked in, soft and pale, the kind of light that makes a quiet room feel honest. Jonah and Leo were already moving through the place with rags in their hands, wiping down tables as though smoothing out the wrinkles of a long night. I joined them without a word, picking up a cloth and working my way down the row of booths. The wood felt warm from yesterday and steady beneath my palms, like something that had learned how to endure. Jonah glanced over with a half smile as I worked beside him. There was a weight behind his eyes that told me he sensed a change coming, though he did not hurry it. When the room settled for a moment, I told him I planned to transition the restaurant to the staff in the spring. His shoulders stiffened first, then dropped slowly as the meaning found a place inside him. He looked at me with a mix of respect and worry, as though he wanted to argue, but knew the decision was already shaped. He asked why I would step back now when the place was finally steady. I rested my hand on the edge of a table and let the silence fill the space between us. The real answer touched too many years, too many memories to fit neatly in a sentence. So I simply told him that stewardship always has a natural ending. He stood very still for a moment, then nodded with a seriousness that made him look older than he was. The bells over the door jingled in the late morning air. Mark stepped in, hands in his coat pockets, eyes lowered just a bit. He asked if we could talk alone, not demanding it, only requesting in the tone of a man trying to find the right footing. We moved toward a quiet corner where the smell of coffee drifted lightly. He began with a breath, then said he was sorry. His voice had lost the polite smoothness he usually carried. This one was rounder, heavier, something closer to truth. He spoke about how he had been trying to impress people he barely cared about, and how in the process he had forgotten that confidence is not built by comparing yourself to others. I let him finish without interrupting. When he looked at me for an answer, I told him gently that Emily deserved someone who understood the whole of her roots, not just the parts that were easy to acknowledge. He lowered his eyes again, but this time it was not shame, only recognition. We were still standing there when Emily arrived. She walked in, carefully scanning the room as if looking for where to place herself. When she reached me, she held out a small house key pressed into her palm like something fragile. She spoke softly, telling me I could come by any time. There was a tremor in her voice, the kind that comes when a person is trying to hold steady. As I took the key, her hand lingered for a brief second, and she smoothed the edge of my sleeve with her thumb, a small gesture that reached deeper than apology. I slipped the key into my pocket and let the warmth of her touch settle there. We drifted toward the bar, the three of us finding seats without saying much. Leo brought over a pot of coffee and poured for us with a quiet respect. The aroma wrapped around us like something familiar returning home. We shared a simple breakfast, the kind that does not need conversation to feel whole. Emily let out a soft laugh at one point, a sound I had not heard in years, and Mark watched her with a tenderness that told me he was trying to learn how to be better. I did not push the moment. Families heal in their own time, and often in their own silence. After we finished eating, I stood and watched them gather their coats. Emily touched my arm lightly before she left a gesture that said more than words could manage. When the door closed behind them, the room fell into a soft hush. I looked at the tables, the counter, the plaque near the window, and felt a calm settle into my chest. The weight I had been carrying for years loosened, as though I had finally set down a tool that had traveled too long in my hands. I stepped outside into the cold air. The street was quiet, except for the distant hum of a delivery truck and the slow drift of snow starting to form in the gray sky. I paused there just beyond the doorway, letting the stillness settle. Behind me, I heard the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the sound of a place continuing without needing me to hold it upright. I stood for a moment longer, feeling the key in my pocket and the lighter pull of the day ahead. Then I walked toward the car, leaving the warm glow of red elm behind me, steady in the cold morning air. The air still carried the warmth from their voices when I stepped out into the morning cold. It lingered the way familiar hands used to linger on my shoulder, gentle and steady long after the moment passed. The snow had settled in thin layers across the streetlights and rooftops, and for a while I just stood there, with the quiet pressing in around me. Something in me had loosened, not enough to call it peace, but enough to breathe without the weight pulling down on every thought. I drove without turning on the radio. The town was still half asleep, houses wrapped in soft gray light chimneys giving off thin trails of smoke. When I reached the corner where the restaurant sat, the windows were dark except for a faint glow near the bar. Maybe the sun caught the glass at the right angle, or maybe memory played its usual tricks. Either way, it guided me to the door with an ease that felt old and familiar. Inside, the smell of coffee from the night before still hung in the air. I kept the lights off for a moment, letting the room appear slowly as my eyes adjusted. The bar sat quiet, the chairs squared neatly with the tables, the wooden floors holding echoes of footsteps from years of families who found warmth here when they needed it most. I walked through the center of the room, my boots tapping lightly on the boards, and reached for the switch along the wall. Warm light spilled over everything soft amber against the winter morning. It felt like a hand on my back, urging me forward. That was when I noticed the framed photo behind the counter. Margaret had hung it up without telling me. My wife's smile was just as I remembered, steady and unguarded, the kind she saved for moments when she believed the world might turn out all right. I lifted the frame, meaning only to straighten it, and a slip of paper fluttered against my fingers. The handwriting made my breath catch. I knew the curve of every letter the way she pressed harder at the end of each line. Follow the warm lights. She had written it long before illness took the strength from her hands. I stood there for a long moment, letting the ink speak in the way her voice once did, not loudly, not insistently, just there, steady and sure. Outside the windows, shadows shifted across the pavement. When I opened the door, a small group of seniors waited near the steps. Jackets pulled tight, their breath rising in the cold. They held meal vouchers in their hands. I did not ask where they came from. I had already seen the quiet determination in Emily's eyes the night before, the kind that comes from wanting to make something right without saying the words out loud. "Come in," I told them, stepping aside so the warm air could reach them first. Their faces softened as they crossed the threshold. I turned on more lights, one switch at a time, until the room glowed as if waking from its own sleep. A few of them nodded in gratitude. One rested a hand on the table as if testing its steadiness, and something about that simple gesture felt like a blessing I had not expected. While they found their seats, I moved behind the bar and touched the edge of the counter. The wood had been worn smooth over decades, carrying stories of people who came here with hope or sorrow, or the need for a place where silence felt safe. My wife used to run her fingers along the grain when she spoke about the future. She said every place had a pulse if you listened long enough. The morning stretched in slow breaths. I poured water into glasses, set out napkins, helped someone hang their coat. Small things, but they filled the room with a kind of tenderness that wrapped itself around me. As I worked, I kept catching glimpses of memory. Emily, as a child, sitting in that far corner booth with crayons scattered across the table. My wife, leaning in, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead while she drew. The laughter that came from them when the waitress brought out soup still steaming. I realized those moments had slipped into the walls, the floors, the way sunlight moved between the tables. They had never left. I had just forgotten where to look. When the last switch had been flipped and the room glowed with steady light, I stepped back toward the door. The seniors were talking quietly over their meals forks, clinking softly against their plates. A single note of contentment carried through the air. I let it settle inside me, warm and calm. I touched the frame of the entrance before leaving. Not to claim it, not to linger on what had been, just to acknowledge the years it held and the pieces of my life it sheltered. Some doors do not close. They shift. They change shape until they no longer confine you. Outside, the snow had brightened under the rise of the sun. The street felt open, almost inviting. I walked down the steps without looking back. There was nothing behind me I needed to reclaim. Everything that mattered had already taken its place. As I reached my truck, a breeze lifted the edges of my coat. The world felt lighter, though I carried the same weight I always had. Only now it no longer pressed down. It simply existed. A part of me, not a burden. I looked once more toward the restaurant, the lights glowing through the windows like small beacons in the cold morning. My wife's words settled softly in the quiet. Follow the warm lights. She had known long before I did that warmth comes from the things we hold steady, not the things we chase. I drew a slow breath and let it out into the winter air. The day stood open before me, wide and unhurried. I stepped forward, letting the snow crunch beneath my feet, and the light followed in its own time.